Since World War II, Americans in general, and Californians in particular, have relied on ever-expanding roadways to keep pace with the rapid growth in population and automobiles. The result has been ever-expanding suburbs with more and more vehicle miles traveled. Recently, concern over air pollution and climate change has led some California communities to adopt smart growth policies to begin to reduce sprawl. But do they work? What exactly do smart growth policies entail? What about the fiscal implications? What impact will various development policies, from building more box stores and strip malls to revitalizing their downtowns, have on city and county budgets? Will they cost money or save money? And what do elected officials view as the challenges and opportunities in implementing a smart growth strategy to ensure their community's long-term fiscal health? We'll talk to Joe Minicozzi, a principal at Urban 3, a national leader in urban design, Lynne Ashbeck, mayor of Clovis, and Garrard Marsh, mayor of Modesto. Growing up, not out. The dollars and cents of smart growth.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. While the booming housing market in the 2000s fueled the expansion of new housing and commercial developments and a related increase in the need for more city services, the following housing crash and economic downturn left many cities wondering how to pay for those services. Some cities declared bankruptcy. Other cities made drastic cuts in city services. In the aftermath, the focus is now on how to create communities that are financially viable for the long haul. Some view smart growth policies as an answer for sustainable growth for cities. Others think smart growth is a bureaucratic interference with the free market. Some, like our guest, Joe Minicozzi, a principal at Urban 3, a national leader in urban design, are suggesting that the answer may be found by using new types of economic analysis to assess the long-term implications of different development scenarios. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Welcome, thank you.
Well, first of all, let's define smart growth. What is it and what isn't it?
Smart growth is a complex term to use. I tend to stay away from it from a standpoint because it kind of predisposes, well, what's the alternative? You know, is it dumb growth? I mean, but really smart growth is used as a catch-all to deal with thinking, I guess, deeper about land use patterns. How does it affect the environment? How does it affect revenues? How does it affect costs to communities? And so it's really a broader catch-all. If you were to attend a smart growth conference, it's not just planners or policymakers. There's social justice professionals. There's environmentalists. It's kind of a much broader spectrum.
And developers.
And developers, true.
Well, let's talk about what's driving the need for smart growth. Is it demographics? Older people can't drive as much. Is it climate change? You know, in California we have AB 32, which sets some standards on greenhouse gas emissions, some reduction goals. We also have, more importantly, SB 375, which encourages local communities to link land use planning and transportation needs to limit sprawl. Is that what's driving smart growth?
Smart growth actually kind of came out in the, I want to say 80s or 90s, probably more in the 90s was when it really gelled. There was a series of movements that happened inside of planning where folks were looking toward alternatives or looking at our built environment and asking different questions. Do we have to have this pattern of growth that's been going on since the 50s and 60s? And a lot of communities were wrestling with the cost of that land use pattern. So smart growth really came out because of that. It aligns very much with SB 375. Many communities actually adopt smart growth principles in their comprehensive plans. My community in Asheville, North Carolina, actually has 2 pages dedicated to smart growth principles in its comp plan. So it's not necessarily direct physical policy. It can be comprehensive elements or maybe global goals.
What are the advantages to smart growth?
You know, smart growth advantages, you know, sometimes it considers all of the forms of mobility. So it's not just cars, it's bicycles, it's pedestrians. You know, if you think about it, what we are as humans, we're actually born with feet, not cars. So it starts with, can a person...
I don't know about in California.
Well, I mean, you know, people like their cars in North Carolina too. We are the home of NASCAR. So, you know, individuals, if you can make your way around your neighborhood, if you can find all of your daily needs within a pedestrian capture, a 5 to 15-minute walk, is kind of the basis of a lot of what this is. How do you lighten the footprint of development into the community, environmentally, but also economically?
Well, let me ask you this. How do you respond to those who argue that smart growth is really counterproductive because it not only thwarts the individual property owner's rights, but it also interferes with the market's ability to determine the highest and best use of a piece of land?
Well, I would disagree with that. I don't think smart growth limits anything. And to some extent, I think that people have a false understanding of what the market is. You know, they tend to believe that this market is this open and free condition where no one is, where it's unbridled and untouched. But as soon as the government puts a road out to a piece of property and allows access to that piece of property, it changes the dynamic of what the market is. The community has paid for infrastructure that has made your real estate have more options. So without that, you wouldn't have it. So the government does affect the market condition. There really is no free market in this situation.
Okay, what would you say to those who argue that smart growth just won't work here in California because we have this love affair with cars, and then, by the way, people have voted with their pocketbooks that they would rather live in a suburban low-density development than an urban, more dense environment?
Well, I mean, I think you all have something to wrestle with here in the fact that SB 375 was also put in place by your elected officials. So how do you resolve the fact that you have these desires within your state to have those choices that you just mentioned, but you also have these goals and aspirational policies that want to get you in a different direction? That's going to be a conflict.
What about the claim that smart growth could actually encourage more sprawl because people will, if cities are constraining themselves as to where they grow, then people who want that suburban lifestyle will simply leapfrog and move into an adjoining community that does allow for that suburban type of lifestyle. So it's going to encourage even longer commutes.
Well, that's all. I guess you'd have to see the data on that. I think that a lot of times that's just a threat, and that the actual real choice of how a community grows is self-determined. If an individual wants to move to another community, so be it. But once a community decides to grow inward and be more efficient on its infrastructure, that needs to be penciled out. Additionally, the cost of that individual to make those choices. For me I want to have a full head of hair. It's not going to happen, right?
Or it'll cost you.
Or it'll cost me, it'll cost somebody. So if I want that lifestyle of all of that infrastructure and all of that open space, not being near a neighbor, well, I should bear that cost of that choice.
Okay. Well, any development, urban or suburban, has both costs and benefits that the city or county has to decide on how to pay for. What's the best way to measure and pay for those fiscal impacts of development? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. When assessing the fiscal impact of infill developments, new housing developments, or new shopping malls, how can one accurately assess the fiscal impacts of these different growth scenarios? We're talking with Joe Minicozzi, a national expert on city planning. So how are the fiscal impacts of different growth scenarios currently being evaluated? And what are the kind of the short-term and long-term fiscal impacts that are being considered?
I think for us in our work in understanding cities, one of the things that's really kind of amazing to me is the absolute disconnect between the property taxes and the fees that we pay into the community coffers. Those fees are completely disconnected from the costs.
So in what way?
Well, I pay, in my house, my wife and I pay $2,000 in taxes. That fee comes from the assessed value of our house. When my wife and I bought that house, it was worth about $140,000. The previous owner had 17 cats and 3 dogs living in it. And as an architect, you know, I saw this arts and crafts house, this house that had potential. My wife and I sunk all of our savings into that house and rehabbed it. We fixed it up. We created more value into the house. In that process, we actually increased our tax bills in the process. Now, it's not that we produced any more costs on society. We didn't create more children. We didn't put in more garbage into the system. We weren't bearing any extra costs on the society, yet our fees went up. So to take that and flip it now, our tax system has a perverse disincentive to encourage me as a developer to come into your corporation, your city, make a cheaper building, and consume more real estate. And with it, I take more costs off the table. So the cheaper my tax bill, I can actually drive up my costs in the process. And so cities don't gauge that bottom line of what does it cost for different development patterns versus the revenue.
So how do you think cities should evaluate proposed development projects, whether it be housing tracts or box stores or strip malls or revitalizing downtown areas?
Well, I think the San Joaquin Valley is actually moving in a proper direction. We've seen 2 economic reports and analyses done by Fresno and Clovis where they've taken a conscious look at what are the costs of different land use patterns should we grow in certain directions. And they're putting that into the community dialogue and putting it on the table. So they're actually really consciously trying to figure out the cost of these things. In the case of Visalia, they've made conscious efforts 10 and 20 years ago through the way that they've adopted their growth strategies as a region. So we are seeing some great things here where they are putting that conversation, but that's an anomaly in the entire country.
What about the argument that new lower density projects have lower cost per capita than high density urban projects simply because they are newer, not going to break down I suppose, and they'll have fewer people to service?
Well, that's a per capita. If you do it on an acre by acre basis, you're getting more in tune with what cities are. Cities are one huge boundary of land. And how you break that up, the only thing that you can control is the dirt, really. And to take Visalia, for instance, Visalia is worth $8.4 billion as a real estate development project, right? My town, Asheville, North Carolina, is worth $10 billion. Now, we're only 83,000 people. You take a look at Clovis, for instance. Clovis is $9 billion, and it's 25,000 more people.
About 100,000 people
than my town.
Right.
So, you know, understanding that value proposal, my town has actually got a higher level of value to it on a per capita and per acre basis.
And why is that?
It's a higher density. We have a larger downtown that was created in the 1920s, so it has more stories. And each one of those stories actually is another cash flow of taxes. Because
you're not adding more services, because the services are based on that.
They're all sunk into the ground already.
In the ground of the dirt. Californians rely heavily on sales taxes, though, particularly cities, for their main revenue stream. So wouldn't it be better for a city's bottom line to approve a big box store or a strip mall rather than an infill development, because simply it generates more sales revenue?
Not necessarily. You know, when we got the data for Visalia, it was actually kind of surprising. Visalia's downtown is still, I would say, in a growing state. It's not nearly as jammed full as our downtown in North Carolina. What was kind of interesting about California is that we were actually able to get that data, which is illegal in the state of North Carolina, which is really kind of bizarre. But so once we got the tax data, we looked at the retail production on a per acre basis. So comparing the commercial retail district apples to apples against the downtown acre per acre. What we saw in downtown Visalia is that at the retail tax production, downtown Visalia is producing about $15,000 an acre in retail tax production. Packwood Creek, which is 100% retail, is producing $11,000 an acre. So downtown is actually outperforming a 100%
And do you
retail
find, because you've gone around the country, is that a similar scenario that you see around the country?
Certainly, yeah. And it depends on the downtown and the shape that it's in. Visalia has some restaurants, it has some retail activity. Obviously, if you don't have that, you're not producing anything. But it shows the opportunity for downtowns to be productive retail environments. We just came out of Nashville, Tennessee, and you know, their downtown is 0.3% of the entire county area, yet it produces 20% of the county's total retail taxes.
Wow. Well, up next, we're going to talk about some of the institutional and financial challenges of smart growth. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Making strategic decisions on land use and transportation infrastructure appear to be key in rapidly growing places in California like the San Joaquin Valley if we're going to be able to accommodate the population growth expected in the coming decades. Yet implementing those decisions are not going to be easy. We're talking with Joe Minicozzi, a national expert on city planning. So let me ask you an obvious question. How do you overcome 6 decades of planning around the automobile and single-family homes in places like the San Joaquin Valley, where you've also got an issue of people not living very close to where they work? So they have to drive typically to where they work.
Well, you know, I think a lot of what's going to end up happening in these next couple of decades, you know, putting aside issues of climate change, larger environmental issues, changes in gas prices, there's going to be shifts in demographics that are going to drive consumer preference. And you're seeing this with changes in the millennial generation and what they're choosing, also with the baby boomers. And if a city is going to be competitive, and again, going back to that word corporation, cities are incorporated. They literally,
you view cities like almost like a company.
They are. Really.
And their asset is their soil.
Exactly.
Okay.
I mean, and for the San Joaquin Valley, this plays out quite true in the fact that this is a community that really understands land. This is a community that understands the agricultural proposition of the real estate. And you see this in the changing dynamics of how people choose crops. And almonds were talked about a lot this week. That's the bumper crop. That's the cash crop that people are going for.
So your argument is akin to a farmer saying, what am I going to plant on this acre? Am I going to plant something that's going to yield, $1 a bushel, or am I going to plant something that's going to yield $10 a bushel?
And why aren't we doing the same thing with cities?
Okay. What about the argument, though, that there are some areas in the state and nation, like San Joaquin Valley, that have high poverty rates, and that if you use smart growth to limit the supply of housing, that's going to push up housing prices, and it's going to make housing less affordable for those low-income people. How do you deal with that issue?
Well, I mean, solving issues of poverty and homelessness, it's a really complex. It's not an easy way to handle, or it's one trick to handle this. And if you look at any city, I mean, San Francisco has homeless. Dallas, Texas has homeless. All cities have these issues, and they have to deal with them in different ways. One could argue that Houston, which has almost no zoning and is the epitome of the free market model, they have homeless issues. So just by having an open-ended market doesn't solve the problem either. So taking that problem and thinking forward, why limit your ability as a community to harvest an efficient, high-returning revenue for that problem? Because if you're actually creating a better, stronger tax base, you actually have more community wealth to deal with that issue.
So you're talking about the efficient use of your assets as a corporation or a community. Okay. What about the demise of redevelopment agencies here in California, RDAs? They used to be available for doing brownfield sites or infill developments or transit-oriented developments. All that money's gone now.
Yeah. So
isn't that going to make smart growth more difficult in California?
Not necessarily. I think the market's going to start driving those decisions. I think that the limited budgets that a lot of cities are struggling with, they need to find a way to be more efficient. The days of being able to sink the cost into the dirt and getting 40 or 50 years to get that return back out are over. We can't afford that. We can't, and I like to call it like fighting obesity by buying bigger clothes. It feels good for a little while, and then you hit that new belt, So cities try to solve those problems by just annexing more land and taking in more stuff, hoping that they'd be efficient 10, 20 years down the road. And the reality of what they find is they bump into that new belt and waistband. The diet needs to change.
Okay, what about the competition for sales tax revenues? I mean, that's, for cities, that's a big issue in terms of revenue streams. And people have talked about this thing called the fiscalization of land use. So, for example, if there are two communities, one community is going to want to have that auto mall because that's going to generate a lot of sales tax revenue, and it's going to lead to some maybe less than optimal land use decisions. How do you deal with that issue? Aren't cities going to compete with each other in terms of sales tax revenue, and so that's going to be the main driver of how cities get developed?
Sure, and also, but I think that we need to bring another family member into the conversation, because the cities are just the top level. There's a county under that, and the counties in California, generally in the studies that we've seen, get the lion's share of the property tax. So how that city chooses to develop affects the county. Now, if you and I are two cities inside a county, the county better pay attention to how you and I compete against each other, because you have the effect of affecting my market and I can affect yours, but we both affect the county. Do you understand that? So,
yeah.
So and I think that's the conversation that needs to get to the next level, is that what happens in Clovis isn't isolated to Clovis. It infects Fresno County as well as what happens in Fresno affects Fresno County.
Well, let me ask you this. There's the tried and true greenfield method of development, right? Build a new strip mall or a new shopping center out on the periphery. It's just a lot easier. Less hassle, less NIMBY than doing something on an infill development, a brownfield development. So can smart growth projects like infill be profitable and therefore attractive to the private sector?
Sure. In fact, there was a gentleman in Visalia, and this is after we heard developers saying, "Oh, no one will ever move downtown; it's too expensive." I was actually pulled off the street, literally off the street, into a retail store, where the owner of the retail store took me to the back of the unit, took me upstairs, showed me the apartment that he built, and he said, "Look, Joe, I paid this off in 3 years." seems like it makes sense to people.
So I think the return on investment is actually better and quicker in terms of paying things off with infill than opposed to...
It depends, but
sprawl.
yeah.
Okay. Well, I want to thank Joe Minicozzi for this conversation. Up next, we're going to talk to some elected officials and how they view the challenges and opportunities associated with smart growth. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. How do local elected officials view the opportunities and challenges with different development scenarios, from green sites to brown sites? And what types of development, in their view, are most likely to provide greater long-term financial sustainability? Our guests are Lynne Ashbeck, Mayor of Clovis, and Garrard Marsh, Mayor of Modesto. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks,
A quick editor's note. Mayor Ashbeck recently joined the Maddy Institute Board of Directors. Well, Mayor Ashbeck, let me ask you this. When you're considering new development in Clovis, what fiscal impacts are you considering? Do you consider things like roads, water, sewer lines, schools, police and fire services, and do they have to be fully paid before a new development can be started?
It's a great question. I think there are three kinds of costs. The cost of construction, easy to calculate, the cost of maintenance and operation over time, and the third cost that's the most difficult is the cost to the whole community. So in Clovis, you have a fee structure that manages all the capital costs, the roads, the sewers, schools are handled by the school district. So we collect some of the capital, all the capital costs up front, but I think what all cities are learning is it's the operation and maintenance over time that's become the challenge.
How do you handle it in Modesto?
Not very well, actually. I think from the time of Prop 13, we've been, as cities, trying to catch up with the whole fee structure. We have started, and I think most cities have started, implementing CFDs or mellow roofs to take care of their parks and their landscaping, but we need to really look at that maintenance cost for police, fire, and our roads. And so we have, I think, realized over the economic downturn here that our loss of housing or the continuation of the housing has shown that there's, I've used this before and people kind of cringe, but kind of a Ponzi scheme that we've used new housing to pay for the maintenance of old housing. And once we've stopped doing housing, we realize that we're not fully charging the cost of our
And Joe was mentioning that
communities.
in the earlier segment. And police and fire, just as a footnote, are about 70 to 80% of most municipal budgets. It's a big expense, and those areas have to be patrolled, obviously. Mayor Marsh, let me ask you this. Do you think there's been an overemphasis on the immediate cost of development, the new infrastructure that has to be put in, and not enough emphasis on the longer term and potentially more costly ongoing issues like maintenance of the infrastructure and providing those police and fire services?
Well, I think that's kind of what I just was alluding to. We really increased our sewer and wastewater and water connection fees tenfold about 4 years ago. So now those are really well taken care of, and those funds work quite well. But when you look at how do you really maintain and continue to charge the proper fees that cover road maintenance, which we're unable to do well, and both our police and fire services that we inadequately really cover for our population base, it shows that we don't really look at the long term.
You know, Mayor Ashbeck, let me ask you this. It would seem that reusing and improving existing infrastructure instead of building new infrastructure from scratch would be more cost effective. Has that been your experience in Clovis?
I think it has been the experience in Clovis, and I think the lesson we've learned is it's not an either-or proposition. So it's not taking care of what you have instead of growing new neighborhoods. It's really a both-and proposition. And I think one of the things we know for sure is when you take care of what you have, you encourage infill development, it helps the whole. And that really is the business of local government, is to consider the entire city today and 50 years from now.
Mayor Marsh, we were talking about sales tax in the earlier segment and how big a pressure and push that is on development, because that's a primary source of city revenue. Has that been your experience, that there's a lot of pressure to approve those kind of big box stores because of the sales revenue they represent?
We've seen that, but at the same time, I think it's kind of a false thinking, a fallacy that sales tax is the goal of our cities. When we get a little bit more, that means somebody else is going to get a little less, and to a large degree, it's just incremental improvement on what we've already gotten. You look at all the major cities in the state, they have similar sales tax revenues per capita. And sometimes when you get a nice new big box, you're going to steal from the city next door to a degree. Sooner or later, they're going to build something that will draw that back. And so it's really not a long-term solution.
Well, I want to thank Mayor Marsh from Modesto and Mayor Lynne Ashbeck from Clovis for joining us, as well as Joe Minicozzi, principal of Urban 3 LLC. If you'd like to learn more about Valley and state politics, you can sign up for our award-winning and free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.
And now, another perspective.
Most cities are faced with perpetual and growing obligations to provide and maintain safety services, streets, public works, parks, and other public facilities and services from general fund revenues. Sustainability of critical city services that do not involve huge tax and fee increases will mean that communities must work together to create feasible, market-driven conditions with compelling projects and attractive locations for infill development that achieve positive and efficient land use results without burdening existing residents and businesses. We now know from fiscal impact models and rigorous economic assessments that our predominant low-density suburban development patterns in Fresno and the Valley are not fiscally positive or sustainable long-term, and that expansion needs to be balanced with infill development in order to create fiscally responsible and sustainable municipal systems going forward. For the Maddy Report, I'm Jennifer Clark.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy.
This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.